Shana Tova. I'm sure I'm not the only one who experienced something like that. I got to shul in the morning of that dreadful Shabbat Shmini Atzeret, stood at the shulchan, and essentially started the service on autopilot. Blessed are you for making me Jewish, for opening the eyes of the blind, for stretching the ground over the waters, for removing sleep from my eyes and slumber from my eyelids. I pretty much knew that if I paused, even for one moment, I would have to think about the meaning of these words, and this would not end well. Do I really want to thank God this morning for making me Jewish? Seems like it might not be all that wonderful at this very moment. For opening my eyes? Oh, they're open all right. Removing sleep from my eyes and slumber from my eyelids? I would give quite a lot to be able to sleep through the nightmare that was unfolding before our very eyes. Thank you very much. I managed to remain more or less composed until I got to the end of Psalm 30. You turned my mourning into dancing and my sackcloth into robes of joy. Really? On the morning before Simchat Torah? That's some sick sense of humor you got, the Ribono Shel Olam. But of course, one does not need to experience a tragedy of this magnitude to be challenged by prayer or liturgy. Oftentimes, the words do not make much sense, and sometimes it's even worse when they do. A friend of mine once lamented the fact that reading Hebrew well enough to understand the Siddur has ruined his synagogue experience. For him, it was the second blessing of the Amidah in particular, where God is praised for reviving the dead. It sounds like we're praying for a zombie apocalypse, he told me. A common way for us to deal with the discrepancy between liturgy and reality is to remind ourselves that the prayers in the Siddur were not meant to be taken literally. After all, they were written at a time when many of these metaphors worked really well. Lords and kings were powerful rulers who could single-handedly determine your fate, not ceremonial roles that seem to belong solely in Netflix specials. The blessing for reviving the dead is said when encountering a friend or a relative you haven't seen in a long time, which is the most Jewish blessing I can think of. Look who's not dead. Not when seeing a zombie, and so on. In other words, we tell ourselves that the power of liturgy lies in familiarity, not in literally believing every word. We may not believe that our vows are literally being retroactively annulled during Kol Nidre, but the melody sure is beautiful. But maybe we're looking at this all wrong. A few years ago, I read a short piece by a formerly Orthodox man who was exploring different spiritual options offered by the various liberal Jewish movements. Oftentimes, those coming from a frum world would have a hard time getting used to gender egalitarianism, to mixed seatings, or to an abridged service. But this was not the case for this young man. When he attended non-Orthodox services, he said, everything seemed to be too happy. The happy clappy melodies, the all too banal responsive readings, and the emphasis on well-orchestrated communal worship rather than individual prayer at your own pace leaves very little room for a personal interaction with God. And that lack of personal interaction may leave us deprived of an opportunity to tell God how we really feel. Generally, we're not all that great at God talk. If you think back of all the high holiday sermons you have listened to in the past, how many of them actually dealt with theology or faith? Rabbis are far more likely to discuss social justice, Israel, or current events affecting the Jewish world than to talk about the one to whom we spend 3 or 4, 5 hours offering prayers. There's certainly no lack of reasons for this reluctance. In a post-Holocaust world, it seems almost like chutzpah. A rabbi would have to be pretty brave or pretty stupid to stand in front of a room full of Holocaust survivors and talk about a compassionate, merciful God. Even if those sitting in the back row, the ones with a number tattooed on their arm, would be too polite to actually say anything, you know what they would have been thinking. Where was that God of yours when my family all died at the camps? Moreover, if we're being honest, the last time most of us gave any real thought to who or what God is was in preschool, when the image of the divine most people have in their mind is some bearded old man who sits in the sky, knows when you're asleep and knows when you are awake. The concept is very easy to dismiss altogether. Instead, we teach that the God language of the Siddur is metaphorical, that we're not supposed to take the Torah literally, and besides, isn't Judaism supposed to be about practice rather than faith? While all of this may be true, when we live our lives as what the educator Parker Palmer called functional atheists, aren't we too easily giving up on an important part of our tradition? We often forget this, but the name Israel, which Jacob received after his nightly encounter with a mysterious creature, literally means the God wrestler, or the one who struggles with God. The problem is, when modern rabbis and Jewish thinkers work so hard to make the concept of God palatable to their congregants, we are left with nothing to wrestle with. Novelist Anne Lamott famously claimed that there are only three types of prayer: help, thanks, and wow. I believe that like much of our ritual lives, and frankly, our everyday lives as well, this perception is deeply rooted in Christianity. While our liturgical prayer may fit neatly into these three categories, spontaneous Jewish prayer is centered not so much on asking God for help, but on fervently entreating God. Instead of submissively accepting a divine decree, we argue, we protest. When God tells Abraham that the city of Sodom is about to be destroyed, Abraham talks back and negotiates. When Moses is presented with his mission to go and ask Pharaoh to let the people go, he asks, "Why me?" The very model on which the rabbis base Jewish prayer comes from today's Haftarah. Hannah, heartbroken by her inability to have children, goes to the temple and prays so passionately that Eli the high priest is convinced that she's intoxicated. She scolds him back and tells him that she is not drunk, she is just mad. I have been speaking all this time out of my great anguish and distress. She is not simply asking God to give her children. She is asking God what gives. Rabbi Harold Kushner, the author of When Bad Things Happen to Good People, points out that in the first few chapters of Deuteronomy, Moses seems to lose his composure. He angrily claims that God has treated him unfairly. I gave my entire life to these ungrateful people, and now, instead of rewarding me, they are entering the promised land, while I'm left here to die in the desert? Professor Aviva Zornberg suggests that Moses is very deliberate in expressing his anger. He does it as a way of giving the people permission to vent their anger at God as well. Almost immediately, the Israelites actually do so. If God really loved us, they say, God would have let us remain in Egypt and send the Egyptians to the desert. Zornberg makes an interesting observation. Immediately after the people's rant, they're giving a commandment that is unlike any that they've received before, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, or as Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi translated this line, listen up, God wrestlers. Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. While we have been previously commanded to obey God, to walk in God's paths, love was never a part of it. You cannot really love someone with all your heart, Zornberg says, if you are so scared to be mad at them. Anger and disappointment are a real part of any real loving relationship. If a relationship is strong, it can endure anger without being destroyed by it. What we experienced this past year was, and still is unfortunately, more than anyone deserves. Several Israelis shared their frustrations with me, echoing Moses' frustration. I gave my life to this country, and this is my reward. But we know that life does not work that way. We know that God doesn't work that way. In the words of Rabbanit Racheli Frankel, whose son was kidnapped and murdered by Hamas terrorists about 10 years ago, God is not Santa Claus. We know that life isn't fair, but it does not mean that we have to like it. Sometimes prayer can be comforting, and sometimes you just need to close the prayer book and shout, "Hey God, what gives?" Shana Tova.